The city beneath the fashion capital look upon the modern metropolis of Milan. Today, it stands as the undisputed financial and fashion capital of Italy, a sprawling urban powerhouse defined by glass skyscrapers, high-speed rail, and a relentless modern energy. Its streets hum with global commerce, and its skyline is a testament to centuries of continuous, uninterrupted progress. But if we strip away the asphalt, erase the Gothic cathedrals, and plunge backward over 1,000 years to the period between 500 and 900 AD, the glittering metropolis vanishes. In its place stands a city scarred by apocalypse and forged in the crucible of the early Middle Ages. This is not the Milan of high fashion, nor is it the pristine, marble-clad capital of the late Roman Empire, known as Mediolanum. This is a city that survived the collapse of the ancient world. Between the 6th and 9th centuries, Milan endured devastating sieges, foreign invasions by the Ostrogoths and Lombards, and a total collapse of classical infrastructure. Yet, while other great Roman cities withered and died, Milan adapted. Today, we will walk the muddy streets, examine the cannibalized architecture, and witness the daily survival of a population transitioning from Roman citizens to medieval subjects. This is the story of how Milan survived the shadow of Rome's collapse to become the dominant power of northern Italy. To understand the Milan of the early Middle Ages, we must first witness its near-total destruction. In the late 3rd and 4th centuries, Mediolanum was the capital of the Western Roman Empire. It boasted a massive amphitheater, a sprawling imperial palace, and a massive circus for chariot racing. But by the year 500, the Western Roman Empire had formally fallen, and the Italian peninsula was under the control of the Ostrogoths. The true catastrophe arrived in 539 AD during the Gothic War, brutal conflict between the Eastern Roman Empire, attempting to reconquer Italy, and the defending Ostrogoths. Milan aligned itself with the East. In retaliation, an Ostrogothic army under the commander Urius besieged the city. When Milan finally surrendered to starvation, the retribution was absolute. Historical accounts by the Byzantine historian Procopius, though likely exaggerated in their numbers, record that the city was razed, its male population slaughtered, and its women enslaved. Even if the death toll of 300,000 was a logistical impossibility for the era, the archaeological reality is undeniable. The great Roman capital was shattered. The grand aqueducts were severed, cutting off the lifeblood of the city's baths and fountains. The complex underground sewer systems clogged and failed, turning low-lying neighborhoods into malarial swamps. When a new Germanic confederation known as the Lombards crossed the Alps in 569 AD to conquer northern Italy, they found Milan a shadow of its former self. The Lombards chose the nearby city of Pavia as their capital. For the first time in centuries, Milan was no longer the political center of the region. It was demoted to a provincial stronghold. Yet, it was precisely this demotion that forced the city to adapt, restructure, and ultimately survive. The urban layout of Milan between 500 and 900 AD was defined by a profound contraction. The classical Roman grid system, the Cardo and Decumanus, was no longer strictly maintained. As the population plummeted, large swaths of the city within the old Roman walls were abandoned to nature. Former residential blocks were reclaimed by agriculture, turning into orchards, vegetable gardens, and grazing pastures for livestock right in the middle of the city. The architecture of this period represents a stark shift from Roman monumentality to medieval pragmatism. The knowledge to mass-produce Roman concrete and fire high-quality brick had largely vanished. Instead, the surviving population engaged in a process known as spoliation, the systematic dismantling of Roman monuments to build new structures. The Grand Amphitheater, for instance, became an urban quarry. Its massive stone blocks were dragged away by oxen and repurposed to fortify the shrinking city defenses or serve as the foundations for new Christian churches. Domestic architecture transitioned almost entirely to wood, thatch, and scavenged tile. Homes were smaller, darker, and centered around central hearths for heating, as the Roman hypocaust, underfloor heating systems were now forgotten relics. However, the wealth and engineering skill that still existed were poured exclusively into religious architecture. The Basilica of San Lorenzo, originally built in the late Roman period, stood as a towering, fortified island of stone. To build its grand colonnade, 16 massive Corinthian columns were stripped from a pagan Roman temple and re-erected in front of the church. In this era, the physical environment was a direct reflection of a society rebuilding itself from the wreckage of antiquity. By the 8th century, the population of Milan had stabilized, though at a fraction of its imperial height, likely numbering between 15,000 and 20,000 people. This society was heavily stratified and initially divided along ethnic lines between the conquered Roman Italic population and the Lombard conquerors. At the top of the social hierarchy were the Lombard military elite, organized into kinship groups known as forai. They controlled the surrounding land and held all significant political and military power. Below them were the Arimani, the free warriors. The vast majority of the ethnic Roman population were reduced to varying states of servitude. Many were Aldi, a legal status placing them halfway between free men and slaves, bound to the land, but retaining some basic rights. Over the centuries, however, these distinct ethnic lines blurred through intermarriage, the adoption of Latin by the Lombards, and a shared Catholic faith, forging a new, unified medieval Italian identity. Daily life was strictly bound to the agricultural cycle, even within the city walls. The highly complex Roman diet, which relied on the massive importation of grain from Egypt and olive oil from North Africa, was completely severed. Survival meant relying on local, resilient crops. The diet shifted heavily toward what could be grown in the fertile, albeit increasingly wild, Po Valley. Spelt, rye, and millet replaced high-quality wheat. Chestnuts became a vital staple for the poor, ground into flour to bake dense, heavy breads. The deep forests that had encroached on the city borders provided a new economic engine. Pigs, pork, cured and salted to last through the harsh northern Italian winters, became the primary source of protein. Olive oil was replaced by lard, and the imported wines of antiquity were replaced by localized, often sourer vintages. While the long-distance, maritime trade routes of the Mediterranean had largely collapsed, Milan's geography ensured it never entirely lost its economic heartbeat. Positioned at the crossroads of the Alpine passes to the north and the navigable river systems of the Po Valley to the south, Milan remained a crucial hub for localized trade. In the 6th and 7th centuries, the economy regressed largely to a barter system. Coins were scarce and minted almost exclusively in gold, making them useless for daily transactions and reserved only for the extreme elite. The economic trajectory of Milan was violently, permanently altered in 774 AD. The Frankish king Charlemagne crossed the Alps, decisively crushed the Lombard kingdom, and incorporated northern Italy into the vast Carolingian Empire. This political takeover brought an immediate economic revival. Charlemagne instituted a sweeping currency reform, replacing the scarce gold coinage with the standardized silver penny, the denarius. This was a monumental shift. Silver was far more abundant, allowing a monetized economy to return to the streets of Milan. Local markets expanded. Trade across the Alps with northern Europe intensified. Blacksmiths, tanners, and weavers found new, wealthy patrons among the Frankish nobility who now governed the region. Milan was slowly beginning to awaken from its long economic slumber. Throughout the darkest centuries of Milan's history, when the Roman state collapsed and secular kings ruled from distant cities, there was only one institution that provided continuous stability, governance, and identity to the Milanese people: the church. More specifically, it was the legacy of Saint Ambrose, the powerful 4th century bishop of Milan. Ambrose had famously forced a Roman emperor to do public penance, establishing a precedent that in Milan, the spiritual authority bowed to no earthly king. By the 8th and 9th centuries, the archbishops of Milan were not merely religious figures. They were the absolute, de facto rulers of the city. As the secular Carolingian Empire began to fragment in the late 800s, The archbishops stepped into the power vacuum. They organized the city's food supply during famines, administered justice, and commanded vast estates in the surrounding countryside, from which they extracted taxes and agricultural surplus. The Ambrosian Rite, a distinct liturgical tradition unique to Milan, further unified the population. It created a fierce, localized patriotism. The Milanese did not see themselves merely as subjects of a Frankish king. They were the children of Ambrose, spiritually independent and divinely protected. This powerful fusion of civic identity and religious fervor would eventually lay the psychological groundwork for Milan to become an independent, defiant city-state in the centuries to follow. As the 9th century drew to a close, a new wave of terrors threatened the Italian peninsula. From the south came the Saracens, launching devastating coastal raids, and from the east came the Magyars, fierce nomadic horsemen who swept across the plains of northern Italy, burning unprotected settlements. The defense of the city was paramount. Warfare had fundamentally changed. The disciplined, marching legions of Rome were a distant memory. Military power was now entirely defined by heavily armored, aristocratic cavalry, the predecessors of the medieval knight, supported by local levies of spearmen drafted from the peasantry. Recognizing that the fragmented, cannibalized ruins of the old Roman defenses were no longer sufficient to protect the expanding population, Archbishop Anspertine of Milan undertook one of the greatest engineering projects of the era. Between 868 and 881 AD, he commissioned the construction of a massive new defensive perimeter, known today as the Anspertine walls. These walls physically redefined the boundaries of medieval Milan. They were shorter in perimeter than the ancient imperial walls, acknowledging the smaller population, but they were vastly thicker and specifically designed to withstand the fast-moving cavalry raids of the era. By fortifying the city, Anspertine did more than protect its citizens. He centralized economic and political power back within the urban core. Anyone seeking safety, trade, or justice had to come behind the walls controlled by the archbishop. The Anspertine walls were the ultimate declaration that Milan had survived the Dark Ages and was now an impenetrable fortress of the medieval world. Between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the dawn of the 10th century, Milan was entirely broken, reshaped, and reborn. It lost its imperial titles, its marble monuments were stripped bare, and its classical way of life was buried beneath the mud of a new, harsher reality. Yet, survival is often born of adaptation. By cannibalizing its own ruins, Milan built a foundation capable of weathering centuries of chaos. Through the integration of Lombard conquerors and Roman inhabitants, a resilient new society emerged, and under the powerful, centralizing authority of its archbishops, the city rebuilt its defenses and reclaimed its economic destiny. The city we see today, the titan of industry, commerce, and culture, does not owe its existence to an unbroken chain of Roman peace. It owes its existence to the sheer, stubborn endurance of the people who lived through the darkest centuries of the early Middle Ages. Milan survived the shadow of Rome's collapse to forge its own empire, not of legions, but of wealth, faith, and stone.